She begged the cowboy to take her life or take her hand, but the one choice she never expected was for him to give her back her freedom. The Arizona desert had always been a place where men learned to accept impossible things. A drought that lasted 3 years. A horse that never returned after running into the mountains. A man growing old with no one left to speak his name after the sun went down. Nathan Cole had seen all of them during his 38 years beneath the western sky. But on that cold evening when a desert storm swallowed the horizon and painted the air with red dust, he discovered there was something even harder to understand than nature itself. It was the moment a stranger asked him to decide the value of her own life. Nathan was riding back to his lonely ranch nearly 20 miles outside the nearest settlement when he noticed fresh tracks disappearing toward a dangerous stretch of rocky desert. Most travelers knew better than to cross that area when a storm approached. The narrow passages between the cliffs became confusing even under clear skies. During a storm, they could make a person feel as though the entire desert had forgotten the way home. Nathan followed the tracks only because something inside him refused to leave another soul alone against the anger of the land. After nearly an hour searching through the blowing sand, he found an Apache woman collapsed beside a stone formation, her traditional clothing covered with dust, and her small leather pouch still hanging around her neck. Her long black hair moved across her face as the desert wind continued to rise. She was exhausted from her journey but still held the expression of someone who had spent a lifetime refusing to surrender to hardship. Nathan brought her to his horse and guided them both back toward his ranch before darkness covered the valley. Throughout the night, the storm surrounded the small wooden house with the sound of wind pushing against old walls and windows. Nathan placed extra firewood in the fireplace, prepared warm water, and stayed awake in a chair near the door while the woman rested safely inside. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask why she had been alone. In the West, some stories were carried like old scars. A person shared them only when they were ready. The next morning, the desert was quiet again. The golden sunlight entered through the windows as the woman slowly opened her eyes and looked around the unfamiliar room. Her eyes immediately noticed the cowboy sitting nearby with a cup of black coffee in his hands. There was caution between them, but there was also a silent understanding created by a night neither of them had chosen. "You saved me," she said. Nathan nodded once. Anyone would have done the same. A faint sadness appeared on her face. "No, many would have left me to face my fate." She sat quietly for several moments before reaching into her leather pouch and removing a small ceremonial knife decorated with Apache symbols. She carefully placed it on the wooden table between them. Nathan's expression hardened with confusion. "What are you doing?" The woman raised her eyes to meet his. There was no fear in them, only the heavy weight of a decision she had carried long before meeting him. "My name is Dakota Whitefeather," she said softly. "I am the widow of an Apache warrior. According to the promise I carry, the man who saves me from death must either end my dishonor or become the man who walks beside me as my husband." The room became completely still. Nathan had survived battles, harsh winters, and years of loneliness, but no moment had ever left him without words until that morning. The Apache widow slowly pushed the ceremonial knife toward him and whispered, "Choose, Nathan Cole. Give me an ending, or give me a new beginning." Nathan Cole did not touch the ceremonial knife. The fire continued to burn between them, and the only sound inside the small ranch house was the quiet cracking of old wood surrendering to the flames. For a long moment, the cowboy looked at the woman sitting across from him. Dakota Whitefeather did not appear afraid. That was the part that unsettled him the most. He had seen men afraid of losing their land, their money, and their pride. He had seen soldiers afraid of storms and the long nights that followed them. But he had never seen someone speak of her own fate with such calm acceptance. "I have made many difficult choices in my life," Nathan finally said as he slowly moved the knife back toward her side of the table. "But I will not choose either of those." A shadow of confusion crossed Dakota's face. "You do not understand," she answered quietly. "This promise was made before my husband walked his final journey. If I am saved by another man and continue living without honor, my family carries the shame with me." Nathan stood and walked toward the window, looking over the endless desert outside. The same desert that had nearly taken her life now looked peaceful beneath the morning sun. He had always believed the land was honest. It could break a man, but it never lied to him. People were more complicated. They created rules that sometimes forgot the heart of the person expected to follow them. Then your tradition and I are going to have a disagreement, Nathan said without turning around. Dakota looked at him with surprise. No man had ever spoken to her about her burden as though it was something that could be questioned. You would challenge something that has existed for generations? She asked. Nathan turned back toward her. His weathered face carried no disrespect, only conviction. I would challenge anything that asks a person to give away their future because they believe they have no other choice. Those words remained hanging in the air like a new kind of truth neither of them had expected to hear. For the first time since she entered his ranch, Dakota lowered her eyes. Her husband had been a good man who protected his people and honored their ancestors. But after his passing, every conversation around her had been about duty, sacrifice, and the expectations placed upon her. Nobody had asked what she wanted. Nobody until this quiet cowboy living alone in the middle of the desert. The next several days passed under an uncomfortable peace. Nathan offered Dakota a room inside his small house until they could find another path. She accepted, not because she agreed with him, but because she wanted to understand why a man who owed her nothing was willing to stand against a choice that seemed impossible to escape. They lived like two strangers sharing the same roof. Nathan rose before dawn to care for his horses and repair his aging fences. Dakota prepared meals using the herbs she carried and quietly observed the empty spaces inside his home. She noticed the single coffee cup on. The second cup remained on Nathan Cole's table the next morning. It was a small thing, a piece of ordinary pottery that cost almost nothing, yet it carried more weight than the rifle hanging above his fireplace or the old military medal hidden inside his drawer. For years, Nathan had arranged his life so there would never be a reason for a second cup. One man, one horse, one bed, one quiet voice speaking only when necessary. It was a life built like a strong fence around an empty field. The fence remained standing, but nothing grew inside it. Dakota Whitefeather noticed that he looked at the cup every morning but never moved it away. She never mentioned it again. In her people's teachings, a person who was ready to hear the truth did not need to be reminded of it. The truth would return to him like the sunrise. Days became weeks, and the ranch slowly began learning the rhythm of two different souls. Nathan showed Dakota how to care for the horses and repair the old wooden structures that had suffered beneath years of desert storms. Dakota showed Nathan how to find healing plants among the dry hills, how to read the direction of the wind, and how to recognize which parts of the desert still remembered water beneath the earth. They argued about simple things. Nathan believed coffee was the only proper way to begin a morning. Dakota believed that listening to the desert before speaking was the better way to greet the day. He thought her meals needed more salt. She thought his cooking was proof that a man should never be trusted alone with a kitchen. For the first time in many years, laughter existed inside Nathan's house. It arrived quietly at first, almost like it was afraid to enter a place where sadness had lived so long. One evening, while a fire burned softly and the stars covered the Arizona sky, Nathan noticed Dakota holding the small leather pouch she carried everywhere. Unlike other nights, she did not keep it close to her chest. She stared at it as though she was looking at a doorway she had never been able to walk through. "Tell me about him," Nathan said carefully. Dakota raised her eyes. She understood immediately who he meant. Her husband had become a name spoken only with sorrow and duty. No one had ever asked her about the man behind the loss. His name was Chayton Whitefeather, she whispered. He was brave, kind, and he believed a person's strength was measured by how much freedom they gave to those they loved. She opened the pouch and removed a small woven cloth and a carved stone he had given her many years before. Nathan examined the objects with respect, but did not touch them. "Then he must have loved you greatly," he said. A tear appeared in Dakota's eyes, not from fresh pain, but from remembering a kindness she had almost forgotten. "He did," she answered. "Before his final journey, he told me that if the day came when I had to choose between tradition and my own happiness, he prayed I would have the courage to choose life." The desert wind moved gently through the open window as those words settled between them. Nathan realized the promise she had carried all this time might not have been a chain left by the man she loved. It might have been a misunderstanding created by those who remained after him, somewhere beyond the ranch. There were people who had benefited from her silence and her obedience. And for the first time, Nathan understood that saving Dakota from the desert storm had been the easiest part of his journey. Helping her reclaim the future that was already meant to be hers would be the battle that truly mattered. The morning after Dakota White Feather revealed her husband's final words, the silence inside Nathan Cole's ranch was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the quiet of two people standing at the edge of a truth neither of them was ready to speak aloud. Nathan had spent his life believing that the desert took everything eventually. It took rivers until they became dry stone. It took old buildings until they became dust. It took people until all that remained were memories carried by those who survived them. But Dakota had shown him something he had forgotten. Sometimes the desert did not take things away. Sometimes it protected them until the right person came looking. For several days, Nathan searched through old records and writings that Dakota had carried inside her leather pouch. Hidden beneath the woven cloth and carved stone was a small folded piece of deerskin containing the final message from Chayton. The words were faded from years of being carried through storms and seasons, but the meaning remained clear. Chayton did not ask his wife to surrender her future to a tradition without mercy. He asked the elders to guide her with wisdom and allow her to choose a path that honored both her heart and their ancestors. The misunderstanding had grown after his death, twisted by those who cared more about control than compassion. That discovery changed everything. It meant Dakota had carried years of unnecessary guilt because other voices had spoken louder than the man who had loved her most. However, the truth was not welcomed by everyone. In the nearby settlement, a powerful businessman named Elias Harper had spent years expanding his influence across the region. He understood that fear and division were tools that made people easier to control. The friendship growing between a respected Apache widow and a white cowboy threatened the old stories he used to keep communities separated. One afternoon, Elias arrived at Nathan's ranch with several local businessmen who respected his wealth. His expensive black coat looked strange against the dust and sunlight of the frontier. His eyes moved across the ranch, noticing the repaired fences, the two coffee cups resting near the window, and the signs that the lonely cowboy no longer lived alone. "It seems your guest has become very comfortable here," Elias said with a smile that carried no warmth. Nathan remained beside the barn, his expression calm. "She is here because she chooses to be." Elias looked toward Dakota. Choice is a dangerous word when it causes people to forget where they belong. The insult was quiet, but it carried the weight of every prejudice both of them had faced. Before Dakota could answer, Nathan stepped forward. "The only dangerous thing here is a man who believes he has the right to decide another person's place." The desert wind moved between them as the horses behind the fence became still, almost as if the land itself was listening. Elias studied Nathan carefully. He had expected the old soldier who avoided conflict and kept himself separated from everyone. Instead, he found a man willing to stand beside someone others refused to understand. "You may win a conversation today, Nathan Cole," Elias said before turning toward his horse, "but traditions and opinions are harder to change than a man's mind." After he left, the ranch became quiet once again. Dakota looked at Nathan with an expression he had not seen before. It was not gratitude because gratitude belonged to debts that could be repaid. It was trust, something far more valuable. She walked toward the old wooden table where the ceremonial knife still rested untouched beside the fireplace. For the first time since the night she had offered him an impossible choice, she picked it up and placed it back inside her leather pouch. "Perhaps," she whispered, looking toward the endless Arizona horizon, "my future was never meant to be decided by this blade." Nathan did not answer immediately. He simply looked at the woman who had entered his life as a responsibility and was slowly becoming the person who made his empty house feel like a home. The days after Elias Harper visited the ranch carried a different kind of weight. The desert remained unchanged with its endless horizon, its dry winds, and its ancient silence. But Nathan Cole and Dakota White Feather understood that the quiet before them was no longer peaceful. It was the quiet that came before two worlds were asked to decide whether old fears would continue to rule them or whether a new path could be created. Nathan spent his mornings repairing the ranch and preparing for the difficult conversations that awaited them. He knew that proving the truth hidden in Chayton's final message would require more than a piece of deerskin and a few spoken words. It would require people to question beliefs they had accepted their entire lives. Dakota watched him from the doorway of the ranch house as he worked beneath the rising sun. There was something different about the cowboy now. The man who had once hidden from every relationship had become someone willing to stand before an entire community for a woman who did not belong to his world. "Why do you continue doing this?" she asked one morning as she walked beside him toward the horse stable. Nathan looked at the old fence he was repairing. "Because I know what it feels like to live according to something that no longer serves you." Dakota remained silent, waiting for him to continue. It was rare for Nathan to speak about his own past. "After I returned from my years as a soldier, I believed that being alone was the only way to avoid losing another person I cared about. I turned my loneliness into a rule and called it strength." His eyes moved toward her. "You did the same with your duty." Those words touched a place inside Dakota that she had spent years protecting. She had never realized that both of them had been prisoners of invisible walls built from grief. Later that week, they traveled together toward the Apache community, carrying Chayton's final message in the hope that the truth would finally be heard. Many elders listened carefully as Dakota opened the leather pouch before them. The old deerskin, the carved stone, and the memories of her husband became part of a conversation that lasted from morning until the shadows grew long across the desert floor. Some elders immediately understood that Chayton's final wish was never to imprison the woman he loved. Others struggled to release traditions they believed had protected their people for generations. During the discussion, Elias Harper appeared among several influential men from the nearby settlement, hoping to turn the disagreement into another division between the communities. He spoke about preserving order and maintaining the separation that had existed for decades. But this time, his words did not fill the air with the same power. Dakota stepped forward and looked at both her people and the settlers who had gathered nearby. "A tradition without compassion becomes a memory of fear, not a lesson of wisdom," she said with calm dignity. The crowd became silent. Then Nathan stepped beside her, not as a man claiming her future, but as a man respecting her right to choose it. "I did not save her so she could belong to me," he said. "I saved her because her life belongs to her." Those simple words traveled through the gathering more strongly than any argument Elias could make. For the first time, many people saw that the conflict had never been between Apache and white settlers. It had always been between those who wanted control and those who believed in freedom. As the sun began disappearing behind the red mountains, the elders announced they would honor Chayton's true wishes and release Dakota from every obligation she believed she carried. The burden that had followed her since her husband's death finally disappeared. Yet as she stood beneath the evening sky with complete freedom before her, Dakota discovered something that frightened her more than any old tradition. For the first time in many years, her next choice would belong only to her heart. The morning after the elders released Dakota White Feather from every promise she believed had chained her future, the journey back to Nathan Cole's ranch felt strangely different. The same desert roads stretched beneath their horses. The same red cliffs stood silently against the endless sky. The same wind moved across the dry grass as it had for hundreds of years. Yet neither of them was the same person who had traveled that road weeks before. Dakota was no longer a widow running from a fate she could not escape. Nathan was no longer a man hiding inside a life built from loneliness. They had both been given something they did not know how to hold. A choice. When they arrived at the ranch as the evening sun covered the valley in gold, Nathan carried her small bag inside, without saying a word. For the first time since she had entered his home, there was no promise between them, no obligation, and no reason for her to remain. The freedom they had fought for now stood quietly between them like a stranger neither of them understood. That night, Dakota prepared a simple meal using herbs she had gathered along the journey. Nathan repaired a loose board near the front porch. They moved around each other with the same familiarity they had developed over many weeks, but something had changed. Before, every moment had been borrowed from a problem they were trying to solve. Now every moment belonged to the future, and the future was uncertain. As darkness covered the ranch, Nathan noticed the ceremonial knife resting on the wooden shelf beside the fireplace. It no longer represented a decision made from fear. It had become a reminder of how far they had traveled. "What will you do now?" Nathan finally asked as they sat beside the fire. Dakota looked at the flames dancing against the old stones. For years, everyone had asked what she should do. The elders, her family, the traditions of her people, but very few had ever asked what she wanted. I do not know, she admitted. That frightens me more than carrying the burden I knew. Nathan nodded slowly. He understood her better than she realized. The first morning after I left the army, I sat alone in this house and realized nobody was waiting for me anymore. I thought I had freedom, but it felt like standing in a desert with no direction. Dakota turned toward him. How did you find your way? A small, thoughtful smile appeared on Nathan's face. I did not. I simply continued walking until someone unexpected showed me I was not meant to walk alone forever. The words remained between them longer than the firelight. They were not a confession, but they were closer to the truth than anything Nathan had ever allowed himself to say. The next morning, Dakota woke before sunrise and quietly packed her belongings. When Nathan walked into the room and saw her leather pouch, her woven cloth, and her few possessions prepared beside the door, his heart became heavier than it had been the day she first placed the ceremonial knife before him. You are leaving, he said. Dakota did not deny it. I must, she answered softly. For the first time, I can leave because I choose to leave. If I stay now, I need to know it is not because of gratitude, tradition, or the memory of a promise. Nathan looked at the woman who had brought laughter back into his silent house, who had placed a second cup beside his coffee, and who had reminded him that surviving and living were not the same thing. He wanted to ask her to stay. Every part of him wanted to. But the greatest kindness he had ever given her was the same kindness he had to give her now. Freedom. So he stepped aside and opened the door. Then ride where your heart leads you. Dakota White Feather, he said quietly. And may it always lead you somewhere you are loved. For the first time, tears appeared in her eyes, because she realized the cowboy who had refused to own her life was the only man who had truly earned a place inside it. The ranch became quiet again after Dakota White Feather disappeared beyond the distant hills. For many years, Nathan Cole had believed that silence was his closest companion. He had welcomed it at his table, carried it through his fields, and allowed it to sleep beside him like an old friend. But now he discovered that there were two kinds of silence. One was the peaceful silence of a man content with his life. The other was the painful silence of a man who had finally discovered what he was missing. Every morning, Nathan woke before sunrise and prepared his black coffee, as he always had. His hands moved through the same familiar motions, but they stopped every time he reached for the second cup, still resting beside his own. He never removed it. He could not. The small piece of pottery had become a reminder that his empty house had once known laughter, arguments about cooking, quiet conversations beneath the stars, and the sound of another person walking across the wooden floor. The ranch continued to survive, but it no longer felt alive. Days became weeks, and the people from the nearby settlement noticed that the old cowboy had changed. He was kinder, more patient, and more willing to help others. The walls around his heart had fallen because of the Apache widow who had entered his life during a desert storm. Yet no amount of work could replace the absence she had left behind. One evening, while repairing the old fence near the edge of his property, Nathan found a small piece of woven fabric caught between the wooden boards. He recognized it immediately. It was a thread from the traditional cloth Dakota had carried inside her leather pouch. It must have fallen there during one of their first days together at the ranch. He held the small piece of cloth in his rough hands and remembered something she had once told him while they watched the sunset. A person does not truly leave a place where they have given part of their spirit. For the first time since she had ridden away, Nathan allowed himself to ask the question he had avoided. What if she had not left to forget him? What if she had left to discover whether her heart would lead her back? The next morning, he walked into the house and looked at everything she had changed. The herbs hanging near the kitchen window. The blanket she had woven resting on the old chair. The ceremonial knife that remained on the shelf. No longer a symbol of a burden, but a reminder of a life freely chosen. He realized that he had spent weeks respecting her freedom while ignoring his own truth. He was free to choose as well. He was free to follow the woman who had taught him that love was not ownership, and that caring for someone meant giving them the chance to walk away. Before sunrise the following day, Nathan saddled his horse and prepared for the journey toward the Apache lands. He carried no demands, no promises, and no expectation that Dakota would return with him. He carried only honesty, something that had taken him 38 years to learn how to offer. The desert stretched endlessly before him as he began riding beneath the first light of dawn. Every mile carried him farther from the man who had once hidden behind loneliness and closer to the man Dakota had helped him become. Somewhere beyond the Red Mountains was a woman who had finally gained the freedom to choose her own future. And for the first time in his life, Nathan Cole was not riding to save someone. He was riding to ask whether two free souls could choose the same road together. Nathan Cole rode for 2 days across the Arizona desert with nothing but a small saddlebag, a canteen of water, and the truth he had carried too long without speaking. The journey felt strangely familiar. It was the same desert road where he had once found Dakota, a white feather lost beneath a storm, a woman who believed her future had already been decided by the expectations of others. Now he crossed that same land not to rescue her, not to fulfill an old promise, but to ask her a question that no one had given her the chance to answer before. When the Apache village appeared beyond the red cliffs at the end of the second evening, Nathan stopped his horse and remained still for a moment. He had faced difficult days as a soldier and countless lonely nights as a rancher, yet his hands had never felt heavier than they did now resting upon the reins of his horse. Because for the first time in his life, his heart stood before a decision he could not control. Dakota might choose a life far away from him, and he would have to accept it. That was the price of loving someone as a free person rather than a possession. An Apache elder recognized him first and approached with a quiet smile. The old man had witnessed the gathering where Nathan defended Dakota's right to choose her own path. "The desert has brought you back," the elder said. Nathan removed his hat respectfully. "No, I believe it was my heart that brought me here." The elder studied him for several seconds before stepping aside and pointing toward the edge of the village. There, beneath a large cottonwood tree, Dakota sat preparing medicinal herbs, just as she had done many times before. The evening sunlight touched her long black hair and the earth-colored fabric of her clothing. She looked peaceful, as if she had finally found a place where her memories no longer controlled her. When she noticed the familiar cowboy standing in the distance, her hands became still. Many thoughts had visited her during the weeks she spent away from the ranch. She remembered the morning coffee, the arguments about cooking, the quiet evenings beside the fire, and the man who never once tried to claim ownership over her future. She had expected him to continue living his peaceful life alone. She had never expected him to travel across miles of desert simply to stand before her once more. Nathan walked toward her slowly. He did not reach for her hand. He did not ask her to leave with him. He simply sat beside her beneath the cottonwood tree and looked toward the fading horizon. "I spent many years believing that strength meant needing no one," he said quietly. "Then you came into my home carrying a burden you thought you could never put down, and somehow you showed me the burden I had carried all along." Dakota looked at him with eyes filled with emotions she no longer tried to hide. "And what burden was that?" she whispered. Nathan smiled softly. "The belief that a man could have a full life without anyone to share it with." The wind moved gently through the leaves above them as he removed the second coffee cup he had carried inside his saddlebag during the entire journey. It was the same cup she had placed beside his own on the morning she challenged his loneliness. He placed it between them on the ground. "I did not come here to ask you to repay a debt," Nathan said. "I did not come because of a promise or a tradition. I came because there is one thing I never asked you when you stood in my house with a future you did not understand." His voice became softer as the last sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. "Dakota Whitefeather, what life do you choose for yourself?" For the first time since becoming a widow, Dakota realized that the answer waiting inside her heart had never belonged to her past. It had always been waiting for the moment when she was finally free enough to speak it. The desert remained silent after Nathan Cole asked the question that no one had ever asked Dakota Whitefeather before. For a long time, she did not answer. The wind moved gently through the branches of the old cottonwood tree, carrying the scent of earth, herbs, and the memories of a life that had changed forever. Years earlier, she would have answered with the words expected of her. She would have spoken of duty, of tradition, of the promises made by others. But the woman sitting beside the white cowboy was no longer the same widow who had placed a ceremonial knife on a table and believed her future belonged to anyone except herself. She looked at the second coffee cup resting between them. Such a simple object had traveled from a lonely ranch to the heart of Apache land. It was not a gift demanding something in return. It was not a symbol of obligation. It was an invitation, an empty place waiting for her choice. Dakota smiled softly and looked toward the endless horizon where the desert met the sky. My husband once told me that love is not a chain that holds a person in one place, she said quietly. It is a path that allows two people to walk beside each other. Nathan listened without interrupting. He had learned that the most important moments in life often arrived in silence before they arrived in words. For many years, I believed honoring his memory meant refusing to live beyond my grief, she continued. Then I met a man who saved my life and refused to own it. A man who protected my freedom even when it meant losing me. Her eyes met Nathan's, and for the first time, there was no fear, no uncertainty, and no shadow of the past between them. The life I choose, she whispered, is the one where I can carry my ancestors behind me, my memories within me, and my future beside me. Nathan lowered his head for a moment, not because he was surprised, but because a man who had spent decades alone did not easily believe that happiness had finally found his door. The following morning, there was no grand ceremony, no declaration made to satisfy the expectations of others, and no promise forced by old customs. Instead, the Apache elders and the people of the village gathered beneath the open sky to witness something far more meaningful. Two people who had once been separated by grief, culture, and misunderstanding stood together because they had both been given the freedom to walk away and had chosen to remain. When Nathan and Dakota returned to the ranch several days later, the house looked exactly as it had before, yet everything inside it had changed. The single cup on the shelf no longer stood alone. The old military photograph remained beside the woven cloth of chain white feather, showing that honoring the past and embracing the future could exist in the same place. The ceremonial knife stayed inside Dakota's leather pouch, not as a reminder of an impossible choice, but as a memory of the day she discovered her own voice. The people of the nearby settlement slowly changed as well. They no longer saw a white cowboy and an Apache widow as two people who had crossed a boundary. They saw two human beings who had taught them that dignity had no color and that kindness spoke every language. On peaceful evenings, Nathan would sit outside the ranch with a cup of black coffee while Dakota prepared herbs beside him as the sun disappeared beyond the Arizona mountains. Sometimes they shared stories. Sometimes they shared silence. Both were equally valuable. Travelers who passed through the valley often asked Nathan what had been the greatest lesson the desert ever taught him. He would look toward the woman who had once arrived in his life carrying sorrow and an impossible choice, and he would answer with a quiet smile. The desert taught me that a person can survive alone for many years, but it takes another soul to show him what it truly means to live.